This was years and years ago, back when White Wolf's original World of Darkness games were the hot shit on the market. I was in a pretty big Werewolf the Apocalypse LARP, around 20 or so players at any given time. The GM, or storyteller, as the system called them, was a good friend of mine, for whom the purposes of the story I'll call Dreadlock. Being a good friend, as I'm sure we'll all learn to our misfortune at some point in our lives, does not necessarily mean being a good person, and this was the night when I learned that about Dreadlock. So, a bit of background. To set the scene, this was probably the worst time in my life on a number of levels. My father had just killed himself after a lengthy illness. My girlfriend left me very shortly thereafter in order to be with my most trusted friend, who had betrayed my trust to be with her and then disappeared from my life. I was suffering from heart problems, which were distressingly similar to the health problems which ultimately led to my father's suicide. I was having deep financial difficulties, and just to put the cherry on the cake, the electronic key fob for my apartment building, which I was and am convinced was a type which was manufactured to deliberately be extremely fragile and brittle, had broken off of my keychain and been lost, and I did not have the obscene $50 fee that my building managers were charging for replacement. I am certain that their choice of the most fragile, easily lost key fobs in the world and their choice to charge $50 for them were an especially predatory set of decisions on their part. All of this was known to my good friend Dreadlock. I was in a really bad state and in terrible need of escapism and fun and relief from it all. Keep that in mind going forward. So it is a big event endgame. Our characters were storming the enemy's underground lair, and in order to set the scene in especially dramatic fashion, Dreadlock decided he wanted to have us all go way up into the mountains where there was a cave he knew about. Nothing about this cave was dangerous. It was quite shallow. It just happened to serve his needs for set dressing. We were all city kids, and a city with a first-rate public transit system, so most of us did not have or need cars. In order for many of us, myself included, to get up there, we had to carpool. It was a long way from civilization and a long way back home for me. Shortly after we arrived, it began pouring rain, which at the moment seemed like a pretty cool bit of ominous setting to accompany the big climactic battle which was to come. It would seem less cool pretty soon. My character had concocted a plan by which to at least partially cave in the enemy lair, and hopefully grant all of us a tactical advantage going in. And so as the evening began, one of the first things to happen was my character standing at the cave's mouth, performing a ritual which should have things gone to plan, started off on the right foot. What happened instead was that I was told that a titanic gout of flame burst forth from the mouth of the cave, incinerating my character. One hit kill. So now here I am, many hours from home and no way to get there, thanks to the carpooling arrangement. Pitch dark, pouring rain, nothing to read, nothing to do. Left alone with the all-consuming thoughts which had been dragging me down for weeks, for hours and hours, while everyone else gamed on. Apparently, in Dreadlock's mind, having my character killed off immediately after the start of the game would just be a cool way to establish dramatic tension for everyone else. A great way to show just how lethal this situation was. My character had been sacrificed for the sake of everyone else's fun, and in such a brisk manner that I might literally have not even shown up at all for all the gameplay I got to take part in. The night dragged on, one of the most miserable experiences of my entire life. The game finished somewhere around 4 a.m., at which point everyone gathered inside the cave for a post-game talk and preparations to head home. I sat myself down, soaked, freezing, miserable, and furious, slumped against the cave wall in a posture of utter misery and fury. Dreadlocks put himself next to me and asked me to hold a light for him so he could read through some notes of his. I did so. Without looking up, I was not engaged in the slightest. I just wanted to get out of the cold and the rain and rest. When Dreadlocks finished with his bit, I pointed out to my good friend that I was not likely to be able to get back into my apartment since I had no key fob, and it might be hours that I'd be spending standing out in front of it waiting for someone else to come or go. I asked him if I could crash on his couch for 4 hours or so until daybreak so I could forego that ordeal. Dreadlock's reaction was insane. He loomed over me with all the 20 or so other players in the group watching on, and literally started screaming at me, "Get a new fucking key fob! Get a new fucking key fob!" As though not getting one was a deliberate decision on my part, as though it were something I had the power to change but was choosing not to. As though it were possible for me to do so at 4 a.m., sitting in a cold, wet cave in the middle of nowhere, and of course, there was a very keen awareness that everyone else was watching him, talking down to me, screaming down to me this way. A ritual shaming and humiliation, leveraging his social standing in the group, and literally looming over me as I sat there in the total misery which his choice had inflicted upon me there. I looked up at him and said, with no hint of humor in my voice, "Stop screaming at me or I'll punch you in the face." And he increased his volume. He was now shrieking the same things at me that he had merely been screaming a few moments ago, as though the fact that I had made it very clear how completely inappropriate his behavior was had so completely enraged him, as he sought to humiliate me in front of his group, that he now needed to somehow rise to the implicit challenge rather than reflect upon the realities of the situation he had created. So I took a swing at him. I'm not proud of that, but in fairness, I had not been kidding, and had made it 100% clear what the cause and effect of his continuing to scream at me would be. As I exited the cave, I asked another friend of mine if I could crash on his couch for a few hours, and he, naturally being a friend and human being capable of empathy, told me that would be fine. The next day, I got a very serious email from Dreadlocks, casting me out of the group. I did not argue the point. I obviously wanted nothing more to do with his game if it meant that there was a 1% chance of this ever happening to me again. I pointed out what a truly heinous asshole he had been to me in a time when I really did not need any heinous assholes in my life, but he absolutely refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing on his part whatsoever, constantly turning things back towards my taking a swing at him, as though that moment justified and absolved him of everything which had led up to it. A year or so later, drunk and at a party we were both attending, Dreadlocks would admit that he had been a terrible asshole that night, which was, I admit, somewhat gratifying, but I could not help but wish that he had been capable of that same level of introspection either before or during the evening in question.